What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. On today's episode we are going to put in our Datsun fuel system. We've got AN lines, bulkhead fittings, AN fittings, ORB fittings, etc, etc. The only thing we don't have is our inline fuel pump. We even have the holder for it. They're just a little backward on those, so that's what we're waiting on. And after going over all of this countless times, I have just now realized I'm missing 190 for a fitting, so the first thing we're going to do is put our bulkhead fitting for our return line into our fuel cell. The fuel cell we have, it came with a supply line or a vent line. It did not come with a return line, so that's what we have here. But the big deal I want to figure out tonight is how we're going to run our lines to the front. We're going to need to figure that out as well. What should I do first?
Oh, run shit.
Alright, so the first thing I did was lay out all of the pieces that I have available. But the purpose of doing so was to make sure that we weren't missing any fittings. We're missing like 5. But I also jacked the car up. I went underneath the car and planned exactly where I'm going to put my lines, how I'm going to run them. And I can go into more depth of that later. Alright, so the first thing I want to do is run down the basics of what's going to be in a fuel system. And then we'll talk about connections and all that good stuff. Let's go over the components we have sitting here on the table. So, some basic components you're going to need is a fuel filter and a fuel pump. This is representative of our fuel pump because it'll be here next week. I can go more in depth on when I get it, but it is a Datsun DF350IL, I believe. You're also going to have a fuel rail that will hold all your injectors, a fuel pressure regulator, and I have a flex fuel sensor here, or an Ethernet content sensor, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't really make a difference. It's the same thing. And this is not needed if you're only planning on running pump gas, you know, but I plan on running E85. So there's a couple different ways that we can go about doing lines. However, for all of this, we are going to be using AN lines. I've got all of my fittings here from Datsun, so that's what we're going to be using. But you can also use regular fuel lines. You can use hard lines or soft lines, depending on what you have. You can go from barb to AN if you really want to. They have plenty of fittings for any application. You've got to be able to spec out exactly what you want. Now that we have everything kind of laid out here, I'm going to try to attempt to show you the order in which all of this is going to go. Alright, so we've got our fuel cell here. You can come off of a factory tank, which is actually what I would suggest, but we didn't have that option. Our factory tank was destroyed and they're really expensive. They're more expensive than a fuel cell to put in, and this fit our application just fine. We've got our fuel inlet, our breather tube, and our ply line. Now what we don't have is our return line, so we have a plan for that. Basically we're going to drill into this thing and make our own return line. I'll show you all how to do that a little bit later. From our supply line, we're going to have a 90 over come over here through a bulkhead fitting in the floor. So this is our bulkhead fitting here. So this part will be sticking up and this part will 90 underneath. So from our bulkhead fitting, we're going into our fuel pump. I wish we had it with us so I could show you, but we actually have an inline fuel pump from our fuel cell or gas tank or whatever you have. A lot of people have fuel pumps that are in their fuel tank, and that's perfectly fine. And then they'll have the fuel filter all the way at the front of the car. So you've got your fuel pump and then you've got all this line and then your fuel filter. And that's perfectly fine. That's how a lot of people do it. OEM, it's 100% okay. That's just not how our setup is, and we don't have a lot of room to spare. We're going to have our fuel pump pretty close to our fuel filter. It will be routed all the way up to the front of the car and into the fuel rail. This actually came with the intake that I bought, which is pretty nice. A lot of the times if you buy an aftermarket air intake, they'll include the fuel rail. If it's fuel injected, it'll be a custom fit to that air intake. Anyway, so we'll route our lines all the way to the front. We'll 90 into our fuel rail, which will spurt fuel into our fuel injectors. If you don't have a return on your fuel system, so basically what I have with my fuel cell right now, where it doesn't have a return, it'd pretty much cap off right here, and this would be it. You'd be done. But that's not the case for us. So we go through our fuel filter, and then our return is on this back side, which we have a fuel pressure regulator and this little gauge here. So this regulates the pressure of your fuel, which is highly necessary. You can't just have fuel free-flowing, not a good look. And then, so we go in here, and then our return is a -6. From our -6, on our return line, we have our flex fuel sensor. These are both -6 fittings. So it'll go through our sensor, give a readout to our ECU. Our ECU knows what we're running, and then out of the flex fuel sensor into our return 90 bulkhead fitting, and then it'll go back into the return that is at our fuel cell. So that is how all of this is going to go together. So all that information is great, and I'm sure there are 100 things that you could add to this fuel system if you really wanted to. So the next big deal, especially if you're doing AN fittings, if you're not, it still attains to you. If you're using soft line with hose clamps or whatever, it's still all the same thing. You're going to need to know the size of your lines, the size of your return lines, and all the fittings that you're going to need. For instance, if you're running your fuel rail in your car and you have a straight fitting off of it as such, your fuel line is going to kind of do this number, and now you're wasting all of this space over here off to the right. Instead of it being a 90, now your hose goes straight down, and you can kind of move that wherever you need to under your air intake or whatever you need. You kind of want to map it out, and mapping it out in your head and drawing it up is great. I did that and bought all the fittings I needed to and realized how off I was. Another thing you're going to need to know is if you're running E85 or any type of ethanol based anything, you're going to need to know the type of line you're running. That's going to be a huge deal, because if you screw that up, you're going to screw up your whole fuel system, because it'll start deteriorating from the inside. Make sure that the line you buy is rated for what you plan on running. Alright, so like I spoke about earlier, we have to add a return line. For that, we have this -6 AN fitting with 2 plastic washers. That's what's actually on the bladder that I'll show you here soon. So we're going to mark up what we need here. Probably just going to match the circumference of these holes, cut it out with a hole saw. Alright, so this is the bladder that is inside of our fuel cell. They sell just the bladders that you're able to run as fuel cells. Just strap them down, you're good to go. I opted for one that had a casing around it. That way I didn't have to build a casing around it. Since mine was sitting below the car, you don't want this exposed to the elements. I have laid out our top and marked where the hole is going to be cut out at. Cut this hole, and then I'm going to stick a shot vac down in there and clean everything out. Hello there. So now that our hole's cut and we've got our bulkhead in here, we're good to put the top back on, and then we can put it back in the car and bolt it up the same way we bolted it out, is a word. So I'm just kind of mocking things up. I've got, 90s off of the fuel cell. Now I'm looking at where my bulkheads are going to fit in. The 90 on the bulkhead is actually going to be underneath the car. I'm going to go under there, kind of see where it needs to go, and then drill up from there. And we're going to go ahead and install our bulkheads. Wonderful. Alright, so in my specific instance, I wanted to go ahead and make a plate that holds my fuel filter and eventually fuel pump, but that way I can have both of them easy to pull off, put back on, and it just comes off an entire plate. I'm hoping I have enough room this way. If not, we can go 3-dimensional and weld up a little plate here that the fuel pump can sit on. But now that I've finally decided on exactly where this is going to go under the car, I'm going to go ahead and start drilling out the bung fitting for the supply to the fuel pump, and then goes through the fuel filter and then up to the front of the car. So I threw a coat of paint on the bracket, so while that's drying, we're going to go ahead and put our fuel filter assembly together. So I have a 10 micron fuel filter here. Everything comes in the little Deechworks kit. What we're going to do here is we've got 2 sides. Alright, so one of these is going to come with an O-ring that we're going to put in it, and the other one is identical, but we're not going to put the O-ring inside of that one. All of this is specified in their instructions that they provide, so pretty convenient. But it's going to come with a spring fuel filter, 2 end caps, and an O-ring, some lube. So the first thing it tells us to do, these caps are identical, but the outflow, so where the fuel is coming out of, is going to have the O-ring. That way it can take the inside of the actual filter here, and it'll mate up to this, and inside of our housing there, it will seal everything together. That way I assume that the fuel flows through the outside into the inside and then out that way. So in order to do this, we need to put a little bit of lube, and then we'll put the O-ring in, and then we can go ahead and screw this puppy on here. Then we're going to take our O-ring. It's very difficult to do through a camera, by the way. So this guy's lubed up, O-ring's in. I know I want this to be my outflow side, so I'm going to go ahead and screw this down a bit. Then we know that our filter is next, and we're going to have, like I said before, we're going to have this open side, not the magnet side, the open side towards the outflow. Make sure it seats in nice, sweet. And now we can see our magnet on our inflow side. So now we're going to take our spring, and we're going to put the smaller diameter of the spring into this little dish. There we go. It's going to kind of want to go one way or another. Yep, so we're just going to screw it on down. Now you can see there's like gaps because I haven't tightened them down. Just going to use this crescent wrench to do so. Yes, it's steel. Yes, it leaves a couple of marks. Do I care? No, this thing's going to be under the car. But if you do care, then I would suggest putting some sort of padding in between it and making all your fuel system that no one's ever going to see beautiful. Alright, so now that we have our fuel filter on the plate underneath the car in its placement, we need to go ahead and start running our hose. So, like I said before, it's going through a bung fitting into our pump and then into our fuel filter. So from our fuel filter, it's going all the way up to the fuel rail. There's a couple of things. One, we need a clean cut. Luckily, Deechworks has this tape on the end, which is definitely what you can do to make sure it doesn't fray when you're cutting it. If you have to cut it with an angle grinder, which is what we're going to have to do. They also sell AN line cutters, and if you plan on using a lot of AN lines in the future, maybe that's something you should look into because it makes a really clean cut really fast. But when we make our cuts, we'll tape up the ends, cut it right down the middle, take off the tape, and then put it into our fittings. So basically what happens is we've got our line here. We'll take this tape off here in a bit, but we're going to shove this guy right here all the way down on it. Then we'll stick that in our vise here. So I put the aluminum there so we're not scratching up our fittings, and then we take our threaded piece and we put this guy in the vise with our hose that's attached to it in this scenario, and we screw it down. And as this part screws in, it expands inside this hose, pushing it outwards and ultimately giving you a nice tight fit. Alright guys, I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, which is not Raid Shadow Legends, which is no one, because no one's sponsored someone who only has, at this point in time, 253 subscribers. So if you could do me a huge favor and hit the subscribe button down below, my goal is to hit 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year. You'd be doing me a huge favor. Thanks, and now back to the video. So we've got our first end made up here. It works, it's on there. I tried ripping it off, never gonna happen. Stoked with how that turned out. Now it's time to make a whole bunch more of these. Alright, so it's been a little while since I filmed. However, what we've done so far is basically run all of the fuel lines. Alright, so from our fuel filter up to the front, we're going into our fuel rail here, in which we've made a couple of brackets that you can't really see. I put those on because I wanted to run that line underneath the car, which I'll show you all the entire way that I ran the lines underneath the car so that they're protected-ish. Oh, this is Josue, by the way. He's been helping me out a ton. These brackets, they have little P-clamps on them, and then now we've marked off a space in which we're gonna go ahead and route this up, cut it off. After our fuel rail, it goes into another 90, and then another 90, and then into our fuel pressure regulator. So we had to put it down here, which makes this fuel pressure sensor basically obsolete. So I'll get a digital one. Our dash 8 coming in over here on the side, and then a dash 6 return down below. So Josue and I pretty much got in the zone, and I just forgot to film because I wanted to accomplish a couple things like the little brackets and things like that that not everyone's going to need. If there's anything that I've missed that you really want to know about, make sure to comment down below, and I will do my best to answer your questions as quickly as possible. So the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and pull our AN line back out so that we can make that cut and then put our fitting in on the end, and then we'll have our supply completely made up, and then we've got one more to make from the end of the fuel rail to the fuel pressure regulator, and then everything's plumbed up minus the fuel pump, which was supposed to come in yesterday and apparently will be here tomorrow, we hope. Lighting. Good lighting's key.
Comment for good lighting or something.
Alright, so one thing we did forget is between our fuel pressure regulator and our return line in the back, we want to add this guy. This is a flex fuel sensor or ethanol content sensor, whichever you want to call it. Basically what this guy does is tells you the amount of ethanol you have in there. So if I want to run a mixture of 93 and E85 or straight E85 or straight 93, this will sense the content of the fuel and be able to adjust the tune accordingly so that it runs efficiently on whatever content it's on. I wanted to do this just because I want to run E85 99% of the time, but just in case there's running out of gas and I need gas, I can run 93 all day long. So we're going to add this underneath the car, and I'll show you where everything's run.
If you ain't struggling, you're not working on cars. You're paying someone else to do it.
So they can struggle.
So they can struggle, yeah. It doesn't matter if it's an old car, a new car, a car that hasn't been made yet, is being designed by an engineer. Cars will bring you struggles, but plenty of smiles, 100%.
Alright, so in the last clip, you saw us attaching the last of our AN lines that we have to make. What we do have now is the last piece of the puzzle, which is our inline fuel pump. So like I said earlier, you can have a in-tank fuel pump or an out-of-tank or inline fuel pump. That is what this guy is. So we have a DW350IL. It says it on here, says which way the flow is going. I'm sure you'll be able to see as soon as I take all the plastic off, but I don't want to do that quite yet. And keep in mind, you have 2 terminals here in order to feed power to the pump. Now we do have a couple extra -8 ORB fittings that'll go on the end of each one of these. So this is the last piece that we need to go ahead and put in the car, and then everything will be plumbed up, and I'll show you exactly the line I made and why I made it. So from our bung fittings, we're gonna go from our 120 into our fuel pump, back around through our fuel filter and down towards the car. Things are not necessarily hooked up right now. Doesn't really matter. And then I just have some P-clamps down there. One line is almost completely ran, and our return line only needs some P-clamps. It'll be butted up right next to our supply line, and we won't have a hose sticking out of nowhere. So it'll all be nice and tight. So when I ran these lines, I ran them next to our frame rail, which is made out of, I think, 3/8 inch angle iron and flat plate all the way through. If I remember correctly, it may have been thicker than that. And then I also have plates that I'm going to eventually put over the top here so that they're all protected all the way down to the end, and we'll never scrape them or bust them up on anything. So it comes from under the car, back through the fuel rail, through a pressure regulator, and then back underneath. Where then we have right here, which you can barely see, is our ethanol content sensor, and then runs back to the fuel cell. Alright guys, so that is going to do it for this episode. If you have any questions, again, leave them in the comments below. I will do my best to answer them quickly, or Jason will go in there and answer them. So like, comment, subscribe, and I will catch you on the next one.
Oh God. Why are you